So we start with the second session, which basically merged together the EU aspects and the Canadian experience. And this will take more or less 1 hour. And after, we will have the US and Latin American experience. My name is Danillo Ballotta. I am working at the European Monitoring Center for Drugs and Drug Addiction in Lisbon. It's an agency of the EU. I will explain maybe later. And we have here with us today Professor Philippe Lucas from Canada, and I will ask him to introduce himself directly while I'm giving him the floor before we treat the European side as a gesture of honor for our Canadian friends. Please, Professor Lucas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I'm going to wait for my presentation to be put up. Perfect. Thank you very much. My name is Philippe Lucas. I'm Vice President of Patient Research and Services for TILRAY, which is a federally authorized medical marijuana production company based out of Nanaimo, BC. I'm also a research affiliate with the Center for Addictions Research of British Columbia, and one of about 50,000 or so Canadians that are currently federally authorized to use medical marijuana. I'd like to start out by really thanking the Czech Republic government and the organizers of this conference for the opportunity to present here today and to be here in Prague. It's a beautiful city. It's my first time here. I've really enjoyed it. So I'd like to also begin by acknowledging that I'm currently, as I mentioned, employed as VP of Patient Research and Services for TILRAY. But I was not employed for TILRAY during the planning, data gathering, or analysis of the CAMP study, and the results of which I'll be sharing as part of my presentation here today. So today I'm going to be doing a brief overview of Canada's federal medical marijuana program. And to start out, I wish I could tell you all that Canada has a medical marijuana program because of the braveness or the compassion of our elected officials, but unfortunately that's not the case. Our federal medical marijuana program, which started in the late 90s in Canada, came about because of the prosecution of patients that led to a number of court challenges to our Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. There was a gentleman named Terry Parker who was affected by MS, and an HIV/AIDS patient named Jim Wakeford, who took the government to court for arresting them or their providers of medical cannabis, and that ultimately led to a constitutional right in Canada to access medical marijuana to treat a number of different conditions. The program originally was just an exemption to our Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, and interestingly enough, the entire validity of cannabis prohibition in Canada is dependent on us having a working medical marijuana program. And so it's been a very complex and challenging program for our bureaucrats to work through over the years. There were many challenges initially when the program started. It was initially just granted individually to individual patients, as many of the national programs like Israel's and others started out. There was ultimately a program called the Medical Marijuana Access Regulations, or MMAR, was put in place in 2001. And it had a number of challenges as well. First of all, the application process was overly long and complex. It was a 33-page application that you filled out with your physicians. You sent that in to the federal government. They took anywhere from 6 weeks to 6 months to process that application, after which you would get permission to use medical cannabis. The problem with that, of course, is if you were a terminal patient given 2 or 3 months to live and were looking to use cannabis in palliative care, the system that was in place wasn't there to protect you or to serve your needs in any way. There was also the problem of supply. Initially, the government didn't have a supply, but they ultimately contracted a single producer, Prairie Plant System, to produce a single strain of cannabis, and that was the monopoly on production that took place from about 2003 till 2013 in Canada. Now, despite the fact that that cannabis strain itself was subsidized by the government, so it was about $5 a gram, the equivalent of about 100 Czech dollars. It was of very questionable quality and not very popular with the patients in the program, And the best evidence is that fewer than 10% of the members of the medical marijuana program in Canada access that supply, with the overwhelming majority of patients actually accessing cannabis through unregulated, unlicensed, and illegal community-based dispensaries that were the majority supplier of medical marijuana throughout the length of this program. There was also resistance from gatekeepers. So the Canadian Medical Association and their largest insurer, the Canadian Medical Protection Agency, were not very supportive of the medical use of cannabis. Like many jurisdictions around the world, the doctors in question had concerns about liability of prescribing cannabis. They were unfamiliar with dosage regimens when it came to a herbal product. And in general, I think it's fair to say that our medical community, which is more used to working with pharmaceuticals, single agents, has a level of discomfort when it comes to the use of an herbal remedy like cannabis. And of course, as they suggest as well, there hasn't, and as we talked about today, there weren't many clinical trials that have been done on the medical use of cannabis, and that served as a bit of an obstacle to getting their full support as well. The program in its 10 years of existence was found unconstitutional about 10 times. There's no other Canadian program in the history of the government, I can tell you, that's been found to be operating illegally so many times, and it's led to a number of changes in the program over the years. About 3 years ago, the government decided to change the program radically. They started a long-scale series of consultations with patients, with stakeholders, and with providers. And ultimately, this led to the change last year from the MMAR to the MMPR, which is the medical marijuana, the current medical marijuana regulations that govern Canada. Along with the creation of the MMPR, Health Canada created the Office of Medical Cannabis, and the Office of Medical Cannabis reports to the Controlled Drugs and Substances Branch of Canada. Now, this was a major overhaul of the program, and it presented a significant decentralization of the initial program, with Health Canada now acting as a regulator rather than its previous role as a provider of medical cannabis, which was something that wasn't a very good fit. National healthcare programs typically don't provide actual pharmaceuticals or actual remedies. They're more used to governing and regulating, and so this is a better fit for sure for our bureaucracy. This leaves, however, service delivery largely in the hands of privately owned or publicly traded commercial licensed producers. So let's look at some of these changes that came about as a result of the new MMPR that was put in place. Well, now instead of a 33-page application process, you can now visit your doctor, get him to prescribe cannabis, and leave his office on the same day as a federally authorized medical cannabis patient. You then take your application or your registration from your physician, you send it directly to a licensed producer, and the licensed producer then is your provider of medical cannabis. So that's been a big improvement on the old program. Under the old program, patients were allowed to produce cannabis for themselves as well as get it from the government, but under the new program, they've now taken away the right of patients to produce their own cannabis, giving the right now to a number of limited licensed producers or private companies that are doing this on a for-profit basis. That has significantly increased the potential supply to patients in that rather than having a single producer with a single strain providing cannabis to all of Canada's patients, patients now have a wide variety of choice of about 16 licensed producers, and as I was just talking to members of the audience, literally 100 or 200 different strains of cannabis that they can choose from at a wide range of prices. We also have, the government tried to address some of the resistance from the medical community by allowing nurse practitioners to prescribe cannabis. That's a theoretical thing because nurse practitioners still need to be approved by the individual provinces where they practice before they can actually prescribe cannabis. There's also significantly increased quality control. So at our medical marijuana production facility, the cannabis gets tested for heavy metals, it gets tested for biological impurities, molds, yeast, etc. And we also label all the cannabis that we provide to patients for THC and for CBD. Along with that increased quality control, you've also got increased strain symptom awareness. So with that tracking of patient use, you have a much better opportunity to determine which strains might be more effective for different patients under different circumstances. And along with that, federal producers are now the main funders of research for medical cannabis in Canada, and we're starting to fill the gap of knowledge associated with the medical use of cannabis, which is, I think, a great improvement, because the federal government itself wasn't providing a lot of funding, and there was no, as we all know, pharmaceutical companies are resistant to funding research into raw plant cannabis. There have been a number of other changes, as I suggested as well. There's no more personal production by patients. Also, the current federal program only allows the distribution of raw cannabis to patients. No alternatives. So we're not allowed to produce oils, tinctures, edibles, etc. So that's certainly not an ideal system. Most of you will have heard now about the use of CBD in the treatment of childhood epilepsy. Of course, those children aren't smoking or vaporizing the CBD. They're usually taking it in oil form. And there's no means in Canada to provide cannabis in an oil form for pediatric use, which is certainly one of the challenges right now. And that's an area of resistance where I think the medical community and the licensed producers are on side. They would like to see that expanded to include more than just raw cannabis, which of course encourages smoking and vaporization. There are also no storefronts or community-based outlets that are licensed or legal in Canada at the current time. In fact, all of the cannabis is sent directly to patients via courier, which makes it different than any other medication available in Canada that you would either be getting over the counter through pharmacies or, of course, through prescription use. So that's definitely a difference that will likely be addressed in the coming years. And additionally, Canada has a socialized medical system, and we cover the cost of a lot of medicines. We don't currently cover the cost of medical cannabis. And as someone who's been researching patient patterns of use for a number of years, I can tell you that cost is always one of the challenges to access for cannabis patients who are oftentimes on fixed income or on disability. And there is one interesting exception to that rule in Canada, which is that veterans, military and police veterans, actually get 100% of the cost of their cannabis covered by the federal government if they are using it for an injury suffered in the course of duty. So we have a government that's very resistant to the idea of medical cannabis in general right now, but on the other hand, they cover 100% of the cost of our veterans, which is an interesting position. As a result of the challenges I mentioned, there are currently 2 existing court challenges that are challenging. So right now there are 16 licensed producers in Canada, but this was a very popular opportunity for many, and Health Canada received over 1,000 applications over the first 6 months of the existence of this program. They're currently still reviewing a few hundred applications. There's no limit per se on the number of licenses they're going to be distributing or handing out over the years, so there's still applicants coming into this program as we speak. The MMPR relies almost entirely on these licensed private producers to deliver this health policies. So these privately owned or publicly traded companies act as both the pharmaceutical company in that they produce the cannabis, but also as the pharmacy as they distribute it also directly to patients. And Health Canada serves the role of licensing, of inspecting those companies. And our company, for example, gets surprise inspections once a month from Health Canada to make sure that we're living up to the good production practices, otherwise known as GPP, which is kind of an amalgamation of good manufacturing practices and natural health products legislation that govern the medical marijuana program in Canada. So I'd like to take you on a brief tour of my employer, Tilray, so you can get a sense of the size, scope, and sophistication of a federally authorized licensed producer in Canada. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to invite members of the Czech Ministry of Health and the Office of Controlled Drug Substances to visit our facility anytime. So you can contact me after this anytime. We'd be happy to walk you through this facility. So this is the facility as it was initially bought. This was an empty 30,000 square foot warehouse where after investing about $25 million into it, has become one of the most sophisticated medical marijuana production facilities anywhere in the world. So this is one of the rooms. We've got over 30 production rooms just like this, and this is what it looks like when it's finished. This is the room filled with plants. As you can see, they're off the ground. They're on movable trays. We're now using a netting system in order to better support the plants. And we're producing over 50 different strains right now of medical cannabis. Each of these rooms holds about 1,500 plants. And we're currently serving over 3,600 patients. This is a look into our vault. We've got a level 9 security vault. The entire facility is guarded 24 hours a day. There's 8-foot gates with razor wire on top of it. The vault itself, as I said, is level 9. And just to give you some sense of this facility and its greater security, the highest level of security in Canada is level 11. That would be for a nuclear site. So this is the best guarded cannabis in all of British Columbia. Because you never know what happens when cannabis gets out in the black market. We wouldn't know what will happen at that point. This is another look at the facility and the outside of some of our rooms. And this is right in the middle there, you'll see Maria. She was our first patient. She's a former police officer in Canada who suffered an injury in the course of duty, and she finds that cannabis helps her PTSD as well as her chronic pain. You'll also see pictures of some of our packaging there, with the labels for THC and CBD. The packaging is tamper-proof. It's sent in discrete boxes directly to patients, and we ship anywhere in Canada within 24 hours. This is what the MMPR authorizes us to do, so we can grow from seed all the way to patient distribution. We have tight rules and SOPs on disposal, on shipping, packaging, labeling, storing, etc. And of course, we've got an active testing, R&D, and research department as well. So in a nutshell, or as a summary, we've got a 65,000 square foot facility. We've invested over $25 million into this, and right now we have over 120 full-time employees. We've just been nominated as one of the best new businesses in Nanaimo by the Chamber of Commerce. We've been amazingly well received by the local community, and I just want to say that these large-scale production facilities in Canada and the municipalities where they have been established have been remarkable employers. They've put remarkable amount of investment into those regions, and they've been well received in those areas where they've been in existence. I just want to take a moment and talk about our research strategy. We've currently got, as I mentioned, over 50 strains of cannabis available for national and international research, including a number of high CBD strains. And we're teaming with Canadian and international researchers to supply or initiate clinical trials examining patient patterns of use, strain symptom correlations, and the impact of cannabis of different chemical compositions on a number of different chronic conditions. For example, Tilray has partnered with the University of British Columbia to fund and to conduct a phase 2 clinical trial examining the therapeutic potential of cannabis in the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder that will focus on military and police veterans as well as victims of sexual and violent assault. This is the largest clinical trial to take, or medical cannabis-related clinical trial to take place in Canada in over 30 years, and the first time that medical cannabis has been studied in a clinical setting for the treatment of a mental health condition in Canada as well. Additionally, we currently have studies on the use of high CBD cannabis oil in the treatment of pediatric epilepsy that are currently under review in New York, as well as in Australia and New South Wales. And I'm personally initiating a number of studies on medical cannabis patient patterns of use in cooperation with the University of Victoria as part of my PhD research. Results from these studies are still to come, but today I'd like to present some research from a Canadian patient population stemming from the Cannabis Access for Medical Purposes Survey, otherwise known as CAMPS. CAMPS is the largest polling of Canadian medical cannabis patients to date. The principal investigator in the study is Dr. Zach Walsh from UBC, and this research was reviewed and approved by the Behavioral Research Ethics Board at the University of British Columbia. The survey is a 414-question survey. It's a cross-sectional survey that was available online and in writing and in person in 2011 and 2012. And it was gathering information on demographics, medical conditions, symptoms, and patterns of cannabis use from 628 self-identified Canadian medical cannabis patients. Recruitment was assisted by dispensaries and by organizations such as the Canadian AIDS Society that serve a large medical cannabis patient base. In regards to demographics, comparisons of the sample to values drawn from the Canadian 2006 census of population indicated that men, that Caucasians, and that Aboriginal participants were overrepresented in the survey. Medical cannabis patients were also younger, had a higher income, and were more likely to have completed high school than the average Canadian. And regional distribution of participants was consistent with participation in the Health Canada program. Aggregate examinations across conditions indicated that pain, anxiety, and sleep problems are the most frequently endorsed symptoms. 57% of participants use cannabis to address all three of these symptoms. Once again, that's pain, anxiety, and sleep. And 99% of the participants in the study endorsed treating one or more of the three symptoms. So these are really the main, no matter what your primary condition is or your reason for using medical cannabis, pain, anxiety, / depression, and sleep are really the reasons and the most common reasons that in terms of symptom relief that patients cite when they use medical cannabis. Symptoms treated with cannabis varied across conditions. Use to address pain symptoms was more prevalent amongst individuals whose primary conditions were pain-related, such as chronic spinal and non-spinal pain and arthritis. Participants with arthritis were also more likely to report use for inflammation and for intraocular eye pressure, and less likely to report use to address anxiety and appetite. Participants who identified mood and anxiety disorders as their primary condition were more likely to use cannabis to address mental health-related symptoms such as anxiety, depression, aggression, mania, and psychosis, and they were less likely to treat pain, inflammation, and muscle spasms. And participants who identified HIV/AIDS or gastrointestinal disorders as their primary conditions were more likely to treat symptoms of nausea and appetite stimulation, and HIV/AIDS was associated with less treatment of pain and of aggression. Overall, cannabis was perceived to provide effective symptom relief. 72% reported that medical cannabis was always helpful, and an additional 24% describe it as often helpful, for a total of 96% of patients reporting that it was either always or often helpful in treating the symptoms. The proportion of participants who described medical cannabis as always helpful was relatively consistent across all conditions. Over half of the participants reported using other medications to address the symptoms they were treating with cannabis, and of these, 79% described cannabis as having fewer side effects than the concurrent treatment. History of non-therapeutic cannabis use prior to therapeutic use was reported by 82% of participants. Now, it's important for us to remember that most medical cannabis patients will have tried cannabis prior to become registered users, and that's proven to be the case not just in Canada, but in the US, and I suspect in other countries as well. Mean age at first use was 17 years of age when they first used cannabis, not for therapeutic purposes, but for recreational purposes. And that's actually higher than the Canadian average of 15 to 16 years old. and the first therapeutic use was reported at 28 years old on average. Individuals with and without history of non-therapeutic use did not differ with regard to demographic characteristics, conditions, or symptoms, and most participants who reported prior use reported increased use with the initiation of therapeutic use, which goes back to what Steph Scherer said today, that patients typically use more cannabis than recreational users. 33% reported a large increase in use, 32% reported a small increase, and 7% reported a decrease, and 10% reported a small decrease in use. Aggregate analysis indicated that 40% of patients reported using more than 14 grams a week, and that those reporting higher use, the median weekly amount was 28 grams. So to put it in perspective, that's 4 grams per day. In terms of frequency of use, 42% of participants use cannabis 2 to 3 times per day. Camps also presented an opportunity to examine how legitimate access to cannabis might affect the use of other licit and illicit substances, which is the area that I've been researching now for some time. This concept, which is known as cannabis substitution effect, reflects the conscious and unconscious use of cannabis as an alternative to pharmaceuticals, alcohol, and other licit and illicit substances, and as such, it has significant public health and public safety implications. The CAMP study found that 87% of patients self-reported substituting cannabis for one or more of alcohol, illicit drugs, or prescription drugs, with 36% reporting substituting cannabis for a single class of substance, 25% substituting for 2 classes of substance, and 26% reporting substitution for all 3 classes of substances. Examination by class of drug identified substitution for prescription drugs as the most common at 80%, followed by alcohol at 52%, and finally illicit substances with 32%. As in previous studies, the most common endorsed reason for substitution were less adverse side effects and better symptom management. And a novel finding was that younger patients were more likely to report substitution effect than older patients. And this may be because older patients are more fixed in their substance use patterns, or perhaps because younger patients simply use a greater variety of substances in the first place and are therefore more likely to use cannabis as a substitute. Overall, these findings are highly significant from a public health perspective. With the recent rise in addiction to pharmaceutical opiates in Canada, in the US, and around the world, and an associated increase in opiate-related mortality and morbidity, the high rate of self-reported substitution for prescription substances, particularly among patients with pain-related conditions, suggests that further research into cannabis and cannabinoids as a safer substitute for or an adjunct to opiates is clearly justified. And this study adds to the growing amount of research that suggests that this phenomenon is robust across samples. Most significantly, I wanted to mention a recent publication by Bach-Huber et al. In the Journal of the American Medical Association that found that U.S. states with medical cannabis laws had a 24.8% lower mean annual opioid overdose mortality rate compared with states without medical cannabis laws, and that this effect generally strengthened over time after the implementation of such laws. So even without promotion, even without advertising or without federal authorization, you find that those medical marijuana states, just having access to cannabis reduces opioid overdose. Additionally, the finding that cannabis substitution affected the use of non-medical substances, such as alcohol and illicit substances, suggests that in addition to symptom relief, the medical use of cannabis may be playing a harm reduction role as a safer substitute to potentially more dangerous substances like alcohol and, of course, other illegal drugs. These findings have implications for public health and safety in general, and more specifically for alcohol and drug treatment programs that encourage abstinence from cannabis. Taken together, the CAMP study helps us better understand the Canadian medical cannabis patient population and their patterns of use. Additionally, our findings provide further evidence for the widespread nature of cannabis substitution and suggest potentially fruitful avenues for further research that elucidates the complex relationship between cannabis use and the use of other substances. In closing, I'd like to thank Dr. Zach Walsh, the principal investigator of CAMP study, my co-researchers Kim Crosby, Robert Calloway, Lynn Bellil, Susan Holtzman, Riel Kapler, and Bob Kay. And finally, my gratitude to the Center for Addictions Research of British Columbia, the University of Victoria, and TILRAY for the ongoing support of my research, and to the conference organizers here in Prague for this opportunity to present here today. To all of you for your time, interest. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lucas, for your comprehensive, informative, and inspirational presentation, especially in this later part. The issue of substitution with cannabis is at least new to you thinking, and is an interesting field of research indeed. Because we have some time, instead of going back to the you situation, I would like to open the floor for questions, clarification, or even comment or suggestion that you have after you have seen Professor Lucas' presentation. If you can introduce yourself, your organization, before to ask the question, please.
Hi, my name is Jan Trenkam from Charles University in Prague. You mentioned that about 80% of patients on medical marijuana have used it or had used it before, presumably for recreational or medical purposes, but they were not registered. I assume that's a higher percentage than in general population in Canada. I'm not sure, is it? 82%?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. It is. The general population lifetime use in Canada is about 44%, and I think that the last year, or the last month use is about 10%.
Right.
So it would be higher.
So my question is, what is your interpretation of that? Does it mean that people who had used marijuana for other purposes maybe are less afraid of using it for medical purposes, or what is your interpretation? Thanks.
I think that because of the wide availability of cannabis in Canada, and I should say that despite a 44% lifetime use is probably underreported, as is a lot of drug use reporting. Current studies suggest that in British Columbia, about 70% of high school students will have graduated having tried cannabis. That's compared to about 50% that will have tried tobacco. So we have a much higher cannabis initiation use right now in Canada than we do a tobacco use. I think that the wide availability of cannabis in general means that before people start talking to their doctors about it and facing the potential stigma, the pushback that they might fear from dealing with this in the medical community or in a more formal, authorized way, I think that patients tend to try it first to see if it's going to work for them before going through the hassle. Now, I should say we see more and more now with a federally authorized program that's kind of expanding at this point of patients that are coming to the cannabis program having never tried it. And that's very interesting. It's also very challenging because then we, particularly if we're only allowed to distribute raw cannabis, of being able to explain to those patients without a storefront also how to most safely and effectively use cannabis. You can't go to your pharmacy and find out how to roll a joint or how to use a bong or a vaporizer necessarily. We give a lot of those instructions over the phone. We're able to help people that way, but it does pose some challenges. And as you suggest, you know, I think that if you're ever prescribed prescription opiates, you probably wouldn't have 80% of the population that have tried prescription opiates before using them, or any other pharmaceutical. So this is a rather unique situation we find ourselves in right now.
Please, anyone? I have three gentlemen. You first, please.
Hello, my name is Bogdan. I'm from Poland. I would like to ask you one thing. You've mentioned that now with the new program, there is a big variety of strains. How about the prices? Have they changed?
That's a very good question. The current price of cannabis, well, on the black market price of cannabis, it's still about $10 a gram if you're buying on a per gram basis. At dispensaries, these unregulated storefront operations, the price typically ranges from about $6 to $10 a gram. And from licensed producers right now, it ranges from about $5 or $6 all the way up to $15 a gram in some cases. And so there's a big variety of price still available to patients. I also wanted to mention one more thing when we're talking about cannabis patients in Canada. The current federal medical marijuana program has about 50,000 participants in it. And while that may sound like a lot, the government's own research suggests that about somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million Canadians claim to be using cannabis for medical purposes. So that's about 2 to 4% of the adult population. That's about the same as we see in U.S. states also that have introduced medical marijuana. So long story short, in Canada, the overwhelming majority of medical cannabis patients are not part of the federal program and therefore are not protected from arrest and prosecution. And while no one in Canada is necessarily going to jail for the personal use of cannabis, we still see about 60,000 arrests in Canada a year for personal possession, and that has impacts on the ability to travel, on work opportunities, and of course has the impact of adding a lot of stress and inconvenience to people's lives as well. So that's the reality right now. Health Canada anticipates that the program will grow to about 400,000 people by 2024. I think it's going to happen actually quite a bit quicker than that. But it's still, because of the resistance from the medical community right now, the majority of medical cannabis patients in Canada still aren't registered patients.
Jonathan Grunfeld, I'm a physician from Israel. Mentioning the camps, it's striking that you mentioned nothing about substitution for tobacco, because many of our patients discontinue using it, especially if they vaporize.
I think that that's a very good point. And in camps, we were really looking at other drugs of abuse, if there was a weakness in camps. And I have to say, I've been doing my own publications and research on cannabis substitution for a long time.